Hi everybody, and this is my first video to YouTube, and I'm gonna go ahead and start by sketching out the cyborg skull that I am working on here. One thing I try to always do is be very loose with the initial sketch, and I try to keep in mind how much of the paper I'd like to occupy. In this particular piece, I'm using a 12 by 18 sheet of paper. It is hot press watercolor paper by a company called Fabriano, and you can find it at most higher end art supply stores. I believe I bought my pad from Jerry's Artorama. I'm not sure where they are located throughout the United States. We're pretty fortunate to have a couple here in the New York City area, so that's where I procured my pad of paper. The sketch starts off pretty loose. I start building up lines as I go. You just saw me a little while ago use a kneaded eraser for the heavier lines. What I'll do is I'll dab it on the paper, and that'll pick up some of the heavier parts of the lines if I feel like I still need to keep some of the structure there, but I have to go over with something heavy for when I start to ink it. So after I got the initial sketch down with the skull, I started adding like accessory parts. I know that I wanted some nose hoses going inside of the nasal cavity, and I wanted some of the brain to peek through. And I definitely wanted to have one of the eyes to have some kind of like sensor type of gadget attached to it, and I wanted the lower jaw to be attached to the skull with some cables, so I added that too, and you'll see me get more involved with that there. Right now I'm going over a lot of the line work with a really thin pen. I think it's a size 0.005. Sometimes I use a gray pen. There's a few different companies that make those. I know Micron makes a handful of different ones. I use the Staedler pens and Microns. I kind of use a mix of everything. Doesn't really matter as long as what you're lining with is waterproof and fade resistant, and it's India ink. You should be fine. Copic and Prisma both make really good multi-liner pens that you can try at your leisure. So yeah, I'm getting the really thin line on right now, and I'll be erasing all of it pretty soon. Adding some electricity, because if this is going to be a cyborg, I'd like it to be electrically powered. Give it a few antennas to receive information from whatever headquarters it's being dispatched from. So I definitely try to use circle templates in situations where I need perfect circles. I use ellipses templates too. They're tools and they're good to use. You never know when they'll come in handy. So here I am erasing everything, and I'm about to start beefing up the actual line work that's going to be in the piece. So I'm using a Micron size 1. It's a good felt tip thickness. I'm going to go over all the big spots there too, like all the lines that I want to be, you know, nice and beefy throughout the piece. Sometimes I'll use a really brand new Sharpie, so it's like sharp and keeps a nice good consistent line, gives it that tattoo style to it. Added some bone parts to peek out from that lower jaw to weave in between the cables there as well. So after I do a lot of the big lines, I'll be going back in with just a size 8 standard Micron or Staedler pen. like that's a good dramatic line weight. Then I'll go back in again with the 0.05 to put real fine little line details inside of there. I had to add some of the cavities where the teeth used to reside. Definitely wanted to give them some gnarly mangled teeth. And a good part about keeping that real thin line on there that I did right after I pencil sketched was so I can know where the lightning is going to be at. And pretty much whatever I would go over, it would overpower that little line anyway. So it doesn't matter if you're using black for those little lines, you know, whatever else you end up putting over, it's probably going to take precedence over the other stuff that you're doing. Just a lot of texturing with little lines that'll come in handy when I start coloring it, so I know where the values are, where certain bridges and breaks are in the skull. I like to make my cheekbones and my skulls pretty sharp. It's a weird little stylization I've done over the years, and where it's not anatomically correct, it gives drama to the skull that wouldn't otherwise be there. Makes it more angular. Starting to block in the stuff that's going to be absolutely black on the piece as well. The parts that I don't need to shade. I use hot press paper because it's smooth, and it can take the abuse from the range of mediums that I put into each piece. And you'll see in this one how crazy I get with the amount of mediums I use. It's not just Copics and Prismas and stuff like that. So right now I'm taking a medium tone green Prismacolor marker, and I'm taking the fine tip end to it to do all the brain matter that's inside of that little brain aquarium that I added to the skull. Give it some reflective properties. And adding some additional lightning. And now I masked off the edges after that was done, because I'm going to take a water brush pen, which is what I'm using right now, and my watercolor palette, and I'm going to get the background on, which is like a cool teal. The brand of watercolor I'm using is a Japanese brand that I can't read, but I got it from a art supply store, and it's pretty good stuff. I'm not going for ultimate cleanliness on this. I like it to look a little sloppy and handmade. I feel like it juxtaposes nicely with all the clean stuff that's happening in the foreground. But I do try to make sure I get it as clean as possible on there where it doesn't run into the other lines, because it's next to impossible to go over watercolor that's already been laid down on paper with any kind of Prisma or Copic alcohol-based marker. So definitely keep that in mind. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go into the lightning that I drew, and I'm going in with a silk dye, a yellow silk dye. It doesn't interact with the watercolor too much. You can use liquid watercolor though if you want, or just regular watercolor, as long as you're careful. I just chose silk dye because I'll be going over it later with marker, and marker and silk dye work well together, whereas watercolor and marker do not. I like to use silk dye to color in fields that I'm going to be using a broad color of, so I don't completely destroy my markers on the piece. Now right now I'm using a Tombow black water-based marker, and I'm activating it with its blender, and it works almost like a watercolor pen to a degree. It just doesn't give that much water out of it. It's like the solution inside is another water-based solution for the marker. And it gives it that watercolory, spit shaded look. So I'm putting those on the values that I need to fade out. I choose a pretty basic light source for these, pretty much coming from like one of the top corners, either the right or the left. This particular situation is coming mostly from the top left. And that's just the easiest one to implement on the fly with objects that you're making up as you go. So now that I've done all the shading for the Tombow black, I start to go over it with my art markers. Alcohol-based art markers do not activate the Tombow whatsoever, which is pretty cool. It goes right over. If you were to go over the Tombow black with another color from Tombow, it will activate. So unless you're very careful and you can work in that medium like that, by all means have a blast, and you can do pieces like this entirely in Tombow, but I do not work that way. It's very difficult for me, so I use the Copic and Prismas to go over the Tombow black with. And like I said, it gives it that tattoo-ish, watercolor-ish look to it. Painterly, gives it a painterly look. It's a good way to achieve that. And right now I'm getting all the gray tones down on the metallic parts of the skull, like the cables that are attaching to the jaw and stuff like that. Going to keep working through. What I normally do, I use these Promarkers that I'm using right now. I use Copics, I use Prismacolors. I don't discriminate to any brand. I pretty much just buy when I can, what I can, and it all works well together. I like this particular marker because it's got a brush tip that's similar to the Copics, and it's a fraction of the price. But I still have an arsenal of Copic grays that I use as well too. They all work. It's pretty much just up to your preference. Copic would be the best on the market and the most widely used by professionals, but you can use a lot of different stuff. I didn't speed this part of the video up because I want you to see the levels in which I'm working and blending these things out. Because the time lapse is, you know, it's cool, it's there, it shows you, you know, the process, but sometimes you got to slow down to see like where I'm actually blending things in and the speed in which I'm doing so. I also don't rely on using the blenders from the art markers either. I just try to step down my colors to its lightest possible form. I like to whip things out properly. Some values up on the frame for the brain that's right there. little by little, it's starting to come together. Blocking in the medium tones for the antenna. And I'm going to be going into the eye cavity soon for the gadget side. That's off to the left there. With the markers that I have, I'm using the lightest one would be a Cool Gray 1, and that goes all the way to Cool Gray 5. Which is like a few steps below solid black. And I apologize for my head being in the way, but certain angles with the setup that I have capture my head, and I get a little crazy and I start looking at my piece closely and my head peeks in too far. So hopefully you'll get used to that popping in throughout the videos. One thing when I'm using brush tips is that I try to whip the ends of it in the direction in which I want to build texture and value. So if I want that cylindrical beveled look, I'll brush towards the center to give it that look and feel, so you see some of the hand strokes that accent the shape that it's supposed to depict. Got a few more minutes of value building before the video starts to speed up again. But I wanted to show you guys how quickly I am using these Prismas. I don't like to sit and saturate stuff from corner to corner, and I don't like to stay in a spot for too long. I think one of the big benefits of these markers are its immediateness when it lays pigment down. So I try to use that to its advantage. So it's still building some values up. Pretty soon we're going to start getting into the color, which will be a warmer color for the actual texture of the skull. And here we go on that. So I'm using 4 different browns that will be stepped down from dark, medium to light. I don't think I get into the absolute lightest part too much, because the dark, somewhat dark, and medium tones I think were just enough to get the type of look that I wanted. And I'm using the Prismacolor markers on this one. They just make a really good set of browns that I enjoy. Like I said, my arsenal's pretty varied with brands. I think every brand makes a good marker that is useful in the toolbox. So I'm basically following along those real little lines that I made when I lined everything out to get the value on the cheekbones and stuff like that. So I'm doing that right now. Hot press also helps out with the blendability a lot, because it can take the abuse that Bristol and other paper can't, but it doesn't destroy your marker like cold press would, which you never ever want to use if you're going to be using markers. Cold press is pretty much reserved strictly for watercolor only and silk dye and gouaches. And if you were doing ink work with washes and stuff like that, I definitely would not use any kind of markers on cold press paper. So after I got all the browns done, I went and got a medium or a muted light blue that I believe in this particular case Chameleon made. And I just went over certain spots to give it a little bit of a copper patina. You know how copper oxidizes a little bit green. So with that brown being a little bit on the warmer spectrum, it makes the blue that I put down a lot greener. And right now I'm adding wiring to it, the wire color. You know, and I'm just stepping down my values rather. A cool little trick with that green is when you use green over red, it darkens the red. So that was a little trick I was doing there. That kind of trick works in acrylic painting and stuff like that as well. So I'm adding some value to the brain matter there with the little medium tone green over that yellow. Which is cool because now that we predetermined the range of yellow that was in there with the silk dye, we're able to pretty much go over it with any medium green and it will still match up with that base yellow that's on there. So it keeps our having to worry about matching up that perfect middle tone. It gives us a little bit of wiggle room with it in case we don't have that one that matches. And I'd go back over it with a brush tip cool gray from Copic to build up some of the values in there. I'm going into the eyeball with a range of different oranges over that yellow silk dye base to bring that out. And now I'm taking a Posca Uni acrylic brush paint pen. I'm going over all the values. It's not super opaque, so that's why I chose that. I'm just putting it on the ridges and stuff like that that I feel like will reflect the most light. And then I took a Permapaque pen, which you can find in any craft store, and it's a even less opaque white that interacts with that acrylic white that I put down, and it steps it down even more, which is pretty cool. Like I said, the hot press paper benefits greatly because we're able to put this type of abuse on the paper. If we were using anything else, it would be disastrous. And I'm going into some of that eye socket with some Prismacolor pencils, some different browns to give it that textured look with minimal effort. And I'm bringing back some of the black lines that I may have lost. Adding some highlights with some paint markers, acrylic paint markers that I have. And I have a full range of colors from Molotow and Montana, and they work very well on this paper. And I'm outlining with a black acrylic paint marker to once again beef up those values. It almost gives it like a Vanta black type feel. And I got really into the line work, so once again my head's in the field of the camera and I apologize for that, but you're getting the gist of how I pull all this off. I think that's a little, you guys can suffer with seeing the back of my skull while I make this skull. So yeah, I'm going over the thickest lines and encasing things that need to be encased and adding values in the background of that jaw where the lightning is emanating from. And I'm taking the liberties of tattoo illustration to to do the lightning without having any crazy light sources come from the inside of the jaw, because, you know, I'm drawing for skin retention, and when you draw for skin retention, you get that tattoo type of feel to your illustrations. Whereas I know sometimes people like to throw light sources, which I do too from time to time. But in this particular case, I didn't want to get too nuts with it. I mostly wanted to implement the techniques that I use in my pieces on this one and keep it stylized. So I'm taking an even finer tip uni white paint pen, and I'm doing all of the highlights on this. This is the bells and whistles stage of the piece. I don't have much left to do aside from adding some more detail to the lightning and to the brain matter with an even lighter yellow acrylic paint pen. And I'm going to start adding some of the reflective glass glare that's in it. So I'm approaching the last part of the piece, and I'm going over with the medium tone green paint marker to outline the lightning. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I like the handmade, sloppy on purpose look, because like I said, it's those background attributes and accessory attributes juxtapose well with the angular objects and things like that that are in the main part of the piece. And I'm sketching in a little medium tone green just to give it some value. And now it's time for the pupil, which I do a couple of different times. I let it dry and I settle on a solid black. And then I take a Pentel correction pen, which is an illustrator's best friend. And I go over and give it a super duper opaque solid white outline to separate it from the background. And to give it some absolute white glares where there's no opacity and it's totally covering completely. And it's all done. We got it finished. The total time on this was 3.5 hours, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. I appreciate you watching, and tune in next time.